She never expected the sound of laughter to feel like a knife. But there he was, a billionaire CEO perched high above the city, laughing at her face as though her worth was nothing more than a joke. His voice ricocheted off the glass walls of the office, polished and cruel, echoing the weight of every boardroom where she had been silenced before. He thought she would cower. He thought she would bend. But she had not come this far to bow. Her name was Amara Johnson, a woman who had grown up knowing the taste of rejection far too early. Born to a mother who scrubbed floors and a father who vanished when she was 10, she understood the world's tendency to look at black skin and see limits instead of light. Still, she had fought her way into education, into languages, into a skill so rare it made her indispensable. She was a translator for corporations who bought and sold fortunes with the stroke of a pen. And now, one document in her hands held more power than any boardroom strategy if she dared to claim it. The man before her, Richard Whitmore, had built empires on arrogance. He saw people as pawns, useful only when they served his endless hunger for dominance. The clause he dangled in front of her translating a rare legal text from West Africa was supposed to be impossible. He had promised her the world if she succeeded, his smirk daring her to try. She had delivered the translation flawlessly. But the promise he made came with something more. Translate this, and the asset is yours. What he hadn't expected was that she would come back not only with the translation but also with a truth he could neither mock nor erase. Because Amara was not alone. By her side stood Mei Lin, the woman who had seen her not as a stereotype, not as a tool, but as a whole person with dreams, scars, and courage. Their love had bloomed in quiet corners, in coffee shops where they whispered about futures too fragile to name. For years, Amara had hidden this part of herself. In her community, whispers of her being too different cut as deep as any insult hurled by strangers. In her professional world, love between women was a liability, another excuse to deny her the respect she had already earned. And yet, standing there with May's hand wrapped around hers, Amara was no longer hiding. Not from Richard. Not from anyone. The laughter in the room cracked as she spoke the words that made his smirk falter. This is not just a translation. This is truth. And I claim what you promised. Richard's smile froze, his arrogance catching in his throat. He had expected her to bend, but instead he was watching his own words turned into a weapon against him. The silence that followed was louder than his laughter had ever been. For Amara, that silence carried echoes of her past off being told she was too black to fit in at her private school scholarship program, too outspoken to be considered professional, too strange, when whispers about her attraction to women began circulating. But she had survived every attempt to box her in. She had carved out a life on her terms, even if it meant losing pieces of herself along the way. And Richard? He was facing, perhaps for the first time, the limits of his own power. He could fire her. He could blacklist her. But he could not take away what she had revealed in that moment. That dignity, truth, and love were forces no contract could contain. The storm outside lashed against the skyscraper windows, as if the world itself bore witness to the collision of arrogance and defiance. May squeezed her hand tighter, grounding her, reminding her that this moment was not about destroying him, it was about freeing themselves. Amara lifted her chin. You thought I was playing your game, but I've never played by your rules. And I never will. Richard Whitmore's jaw tightened, the thin lines of his face straining as if the very idea of being challenged offended the architecture of his being. For years, his empire had been built on intimidation, lawyers who folded under pressure, employees who swallowed humiliation for the promise of promotion, entire families destroyed in his pursuit of profit. But here, standing in his pristine office with thunder cracking against the skyline, was someone who would not fold. You think a piece of paper gives you leverage? Richard's voice was low, dangerous. He rose from his chair, towering, his tailored suit gleaming under the fluorescent lights like armor. You think anyone will take you seriously? You are nothing, Amara. Nothing but a translator. The word stung, not because it was true, but because of the venom he poured into Ida's if language itself was meaningless, as if her entire life's work was an afterthought. She had been called worse, but from him, it felt like a dismissal of her humanity. Before she could respond, May spoke. Her voice, though calm, cut sharper than Richard's fury. She's not nothing. She is everything you fear. Proof that your power is fragile, that your word can be held against you, and that dignity cannot be bought. Richard's eyes flicked to May with a sneer. And who are you? Her little sidekick? Do you think love will save her here? This is business, sweetheart. Cold, merciless business. And in my world, love is a liability. Amara felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with a familiar anger. She had lived her whole life being told her existence was a liability. To her school, she was a quota. To her bosses, she was a risk. To her family, when she finally revealed her truth, she was a disappointment. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, weary and lined from years of cleaning homes that would never be hers. The day Amara had whispered, "Mama, I love her," the silence had been unbearable, not because it was filled with screaming, but because it was filled with resignation, as if her mother believed another burden had been laid upon their already heavy shoulders. "Life is already hard enough for you as a black woman," her mother had said. "Why make it harder?" That memory, once a wound, was now a scar, and scars were reminders of survival. Amara stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and Richard's looming presence. "You don't get to decide what is liability and what is power. You promised. You said if I translated it, the asset was mine. Well, here it is. The world doesn't run on your arrogance alone anymore." Richard smirked again, though the confidence behind it was cracked. "You really believe anyone outside this room will honor a word I gave you? Do you know how many governments bend to me? How many judges sit in my pocket? You think anyone will side with a black lesbian translator over me?" The cruelty of it hit like a blade, not because of the slur itself, but because it revealed the ugly truth. This wasn't about business. It was about erasure, about reminding her that the world was not built for people like her to win. But this time she did not flinch. "Then let them see," she said, her voice rising above the thunder outside. "Let them see who you really are." She held up the document, the one she had translated with painstaking care, the one that bound his empire to accountability. And in that moment, she knew whether she won or lost, whether the world stood with her or against her. She had already broken his illusion of invincibility. May moved closer, her shoulder against Amara's, her presence a reminder that love was not weakness, but a shield. "We're not afraid of you," she whispered, loud enough for Richard to hear. The room seemed to tilt then, the skyscraper trembling under the storm's wrath. Richard turned away, pacing to the window, his reflection fractured in the glass. For a moment, he almost looked small, like a man confronting a truth he could not crush with money or manipulation. "Do you know what happens to people who cross me?" he muttered, his voice distant. "They disappear. They lose everything. Their names vanish from contracts. Their bank accounts dry up. Their families crumble under the weight of debts they never owed. That is what I can do to you." Amara's heart pounded. Fear was natural, inevitable, but she thought of the generations before her grandmother who had marched through segregated streets, her mother who had endured backbreaking labor to keep her fed, every ancestor who had survived on courage when the world offered nothing else. To walk away now would be to betray them. She lifted her chin. "Then do it. Try to erase me, because even if you destroy everything I own, you cannot destroy who I am. And you cannot destroy us." Her hand tightened around May's. Richard turned back, his eyes narrowing at the sight of their joined hands. It was not just the defiance that unsettled him, it was the love, unashamed, radiant even in the face of his threats. Love was something he could never buy, never control, never fully understand. The silence stretched long, broken only by the rumble of thunder. Finally, Richard spoke, his tone sharp, clipped. "Get out of my office." Amara's breath caught. For a moment, she thought he might lunge, might snatch the paper from her hand, might order security to drag them both out. But instead, he sat back down in his chair, the weight of his empire suddenly pressing down on his shoulders. He refused to meet her eyes. She had expected a battle, a scream, an eruption. Instead, his dismissal was Warsi refusal to acknowledge her victory, but also a failure to reassert his power. It was the first crack in his fortress, and she saw it clearly. May tugged her hand gently. "Let's go," she whispered. Amara hesitated. Every nerve in her body screamed to fight, to demand acknowledgement, to burn his arrogance to ash. But she realized then that true power was not in forcing him to admit defeat, it was in walking away with her dignity intact, with her love unbroken, with her promise to herself fulfilled. As they turned toward the door, Richard's voice followed them, hollow and strained. "This isn't over." Amara did not look back. "It never is." The elevator ride down from the top floor felt endless, the hum of machinery drowning out the chaos of her thoughts. May leaned her head against Amara's shoulder, her touch grounding, tender. "You did it," May murmured. Amara let out a shaky laugh. "Did I? He still has everything. The money, the lawyers, the power. What do I have?" May tilted her head up, her eyes soft but unwavering. "You have the truth, and you have me. That's more than he'll ever have." The words pierced through Amara's exhaustion, flooding her with warmth. She thought again of her mother, of the disappointment that had once weighed heavy between them. Perhaps her mother had only feared what the world would do to her. Perhaps one day she would see that love was not a curse but a liberation. When the elevator doors opened, the storm had calmed, leaving the city washed and glistening under the pale glow of streetlights. The world outside still looked ruthless, indifferent. But for the first time, Amara felt something stronger than fear. She felt hope. The following days blurred into a whirlwind of decisions. The document she had translated was more than a contract, it was evidence. Evidence of Richard's corruption, of deals struck in shadows, of promises made to exploit rather than to honor. She knew exposing it would put her at risk. She also knew it might be the only way to shatter his untouchable facade. Everywhere she turned, voices whispered caution. Friends warned her of the cost. Even her colleagues, who admired her courage in private, begged her not to go further. "You'll be blacklisted," one said. "You'll never work in this field again." But May stood by her, night after night, reminding her that their fight was bigger than contracts and careers. "You're not just standing up to him," she said. "You're standing up to every voice that told you you weren't enough." Amara knew she was right, and so she began to plan carefully, meticulously. If Richard thought he could silence her, he had underestimated the strength of a woman who had carried silence her whole life and finally decided to break it. And so the stage was set not just for a battle of power, but for a reckoning that would ripple far beyond the walls of Richard Whitmore's empire. The night Amara and May decided to act, the city seemed to hold its breath. The streets were slick with rain, neon signs flickered in puddles, and the hum of traffic carried a tension that mirrored the storm brewing inside Amara. She sat at the small wooden table in their apartment, the translated document spread out before her, annotated, highlighted, its margins filled with her neat handwriting. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a weapon. May poured 2 cups of tea, setting one beside Amara's hand. "We have to be careful," she said quietly. Her voice trembled despite the calm she tried to project. "If this gets out too soon, he'll bury it. He'll bury us." Amara's eyes stayed on the document. The lines of legal jargon spoke of more than money, they spoke of blood, of exploitation, of lives stolen in the pursuit of empire. She whispered, almost to herself, "He already tried to bury me my whole life. He doesn't get to win this time." May reached across the table, her fingers lacing with Amara's. "Then we'll do it together." It was in that moment Amara realized the depth of what they were fighting for. Not just justice, not just dignity, but the right to live without hiding, without bowing, without pretending. The plan was simple in theory, dangerous in execution. Deliver the translation to a journalist who had spent years exposing corruption at the highest levels. The woman's name was Carla Mendez, a Latina reporter whose career had been built on taking down untouchable men. If anyone could ensure Richard Whitmore's empire cracked open under the weight of its own lies, it was her. But finding Carla meant risk. Richard had eyes everywhere: law firms, newspapers, even government offices. One wrong move and Amara could lose everything before the truth saw daylight. They chose a quiet cafe on the east side of town. One of those places where poets scribbled in notebooks and musicians strummed old guitars in the corner. The kind of place where people went to disappear, not to be found. Carla arrived late, a trench coat pulled tight against the night air, her eyes sharp and scanning before she slid into the booth across from Amara and May. "You have something for me?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. Amara handed her the folder, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might give them away. "This proves everything," she said. "The fraud, the stolen assets, the broken promises. It's all here." Carla flipped through the pages quickly, her practiced eyes catching details that would take others hours. She paused, her brow furrowing. "Do you realize what this means?" Amara swallowed. "It means he can't hide anymore." Carla's lips curved into a thin smile. "It also means he'll come after you. Hard. You ready for that?" Amara hesitated. She thought of her mother, still silent, still distant. She thought of her colleagues, too afraid to stand with her. She thought of the weight of centuries pressing against her skin. Then she looked at May, whose steady gaze never wavered. "Yes," Amara said. "I'm ready." Carla closed the folder with finality. "Then so am I." The first article hit the news within 48 hours. A headline splashed across the morning feeds. "Billionaire Richard Whitmore accused of fraud and exploitation." Beneath it, excerpts from the translation laid bare the corruption Richard had worked so hard to keep hidden. The reaction was immediate. Investors panicked. Stocks wavered. Politicians who had once boasted of their ties to Whitmore suddenly grew silent. And Richard himself? He raged. Amara knew because he called her. Her phone buzzed late one night, the caller ID flashing a name she had once feared. "Against May's protest," she answered. "You think you've won?" Richard's voice was venom through the line. "Do you know how many enemies you've just made? They'll crush you, Amara. They'll crush your little girlfriend too." Amara's hand trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "You did this to yourself, Richard. All I did was tell the truth." His laugh was hollow, desperate. "The truth doesn't matter. Power does. And you don't have any." She hung up before he could say more, her chest heaving. May wrapped her arms around her, holding her as the weight of the moment crashed over her. "He's scared," May whispered. "That's why he's lashing out. He's not untouchable anymore." Amara clung to her, silently repeating the words like a prayer. But Richard was not a man to crumble quietly. He fought back with everything he had: legal teams filing injunctions, media outlets smearing Amara's name, whispers spreading that she was unstable, that her relationship made her biased, that she was nothing more than a woman scorned. Old scars reopened. Every insult she had endured about her race, her sexuality, her worth, came rushing back in headlines and comment sections. The world outside their apartment became a battlefield, and Amara wondered if the truth had been worth the cost. One evening, as they sat in the dim glow of their kitchen, May took Amara's hands in hers. "You can walk away," she said softly. "No one would blame you. We can disappear, start over somewhere new." Amara looked at her, tears brimming in her eyes. "And what about everyone else who can't walk away? What about the next girl they tell is worthless, the next woman who hides her love, the next family crushed under his greed? If I walk away, I'm telling them he was right." May's eyes glistened, but she nodded. "Then we fight." The fight took everything. Nights bled into mornings. Court hearings stretched endlessly. Carla's articles became a lifeline, each new revelation adding cracks to Richard's empire. But with every victory came backlash: threats, surveillance, shadows lingering too close when they walked home. Amara's mother finally called after months of silence. Her voice was hesitant, weary. "Baby, are you safe?" Amara's throat tightened. "I don't know." There was a pause, then a sigh heavy with years of worry. "I never wanted your life to be harder. But I see no, it's not about harder. It's about right. And I'm proud of you. Tears spilled down Amara's cheeks. For the first time in years, the wall between them cracked. Thank you, Mama. The climax came in a courtroom. Cameras lined the aisles, journalists scribbling furiously as Richard Whitmore, the man who once sneered at the idea of being challenged, was forced to sit across from Amara. He still tried to smile, that same arrogant curve of the lips. But his eyes betrayed him, tired, cornered, unraveling. The judge asked for the translation to be read aloud, each line echoing in the chamber like a verdict. Amara's voice did not shake as she read, her words carrying not just the weight of language, but the weight of truth. When she finished, silence filled the room. Then, slowly, applause began, not from the officials, but from the people gathered in the back, those who had come to witness history. It swelled, breaking the silence Richard had always used as his shield. For once, his laughter did not come. When the verdict was delivered weeks later, fraud confirmed, assets seized, restitution ordered, the world shifted. Richard's empire crumbled piece by piece, not overnight, but enough to prove he was no longer invincible. Amara and May stood on the courthouse steps, hand in hand, the crowd of reporters shouting questions. Amara spoke only once. This was never about me. It was about every person told they don't matter. Today proves they do. Later that night, in the quiet of their apartment, Amara rested her head on May's lap as they watched the city lights flicker. Do you think it's really over? May asked. Amara closed her eyes, a faint smile touching her lips. No, but it's a beginning. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise. That promise stretched beyond femto families who no longer had to fear silence, to communities who saw themselves reflected in Amara's defiance, to every young person who believed love was worth hiding. The road ahead was still long. Prejudice did not vanish with a verdict. Racism and homophobia would not crumble in a single generation. But Amara knew now that her fight, their fight, had left a mark. And as May kissed her forehead, whispering, "We're free," Amara believed it. The weeks after the verdict were strangely quiet. For years, Amara's life had been shaped by the constant push and pull of survival. Surviving her mother's silence, surviving society's judgment, surviving Richard's arrogance. Now, for the first time, there was no immediate enemy to confront, no looming threat pressing down on her shoulders. But quiet did not mean peace. On the news, Richard's downfall became a spectacle. Documentaries dissected his greed. Late-night hosts mocked his fall from grace. And think pieces debated what his empire's collapse meant for capitalism. Yet rarely did anyone mention the woman whose translation had toppled him. Amara's face appeared in articles, her name in hashtags, but the headlines always reduced her to something smaller: Black lesbian translator brings down billionaire. They celebrated her courage, yes, but always as a curiosity, a novelty, a footnote in a larger story. Amara felt the weight of that invisibility. Even in victory, she was diminished. One evening, as she sat on their apartment balcony, watching the city pulse beneath them, May joined her with 2 mugs of tea. "You're quiet tonight," May said softly. Amara stared at the skyline, the lights like constellations of human ambition. "It feels like they're celebrating him more than they're celebrating what we stood for. He's the headline. I'm just the plot twist." May set her mug down, crouching so her eyes met Amara's. "Amara, you are the story, not Richard, not the empire. You showed the world that truth can break chains, that love can't be erased. You don't need their headlines to prove it." Amara wanted to believe her. She leaned into May's touch, feeling the warmth of her hand against her cheek. "Sometimes it feels like no matter what we do, they'll always see us as less." May's voice was steady, filled with quiet fire. "Then we make them see us as more." It was May's idea to start the foundation. At first, Amara resisted. She was tired, worn thin by years of fighting. But May kept planting the seed. What if we built something bigger than us? What if we gave others the chance to stand where you stood, to speak where you spoke? The Amara Johnson Foundation for Justice and Language was born 6 months later. Its mission was clear: to provide legal and linguistic support for marginalized communities silenced by systems that thrived on their invisibility. Translators, lawyers, activists all working together to give voice to those who had been told they had none. At the opening ceremony, Amara stood at the podium, her hands trembling as cameras flashed. She looked out at the sea of faces. Young women holding hands without fear, families of every shade, elders who had fought battles before her, children who deserved a freer future. She took a deep breath. When I was a little girl, I believed language was power. I thought if I could learn enough words, if I could translate every sentence, maybe the world would finally listen. But I learned that words mean nothing without truth, and truth means nothing without courage. This foundation isn't about me. It's about all of us. About making sure no one ever has to fight alone. The applause was thunderous, but what mattered most was the sight of her mother in the front row, tears streaming down her face, clapping harder than anyone else. After the ceremony, her mother pulled her into an embrace. "Baby," she whispered, "I was wrong. Loving her doesn't make life harder. It makes you stronger. I see it now." Amara wept into her mother's shoulder, the years of silence finally breaking. But even as the foundation flourished, shadows lingered. Richard Whitmore had been stripped of much of his empire, but men like him never vanished completely. Rumors swirled of offshore accounts, hidden allies, plans to resurface under another name. And beyond him, there were others: billionaires, politicians, corporations ready to take his place. One night, Amara woke from a dream where Richard's laughter echoed through empty hallways, taunting her, reminding her that one victory was not the end. She sat up, sweat dampening her skin, and May stirred beside her. "You okay?" May murmured, half asleep. Amara pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Yeah, just remembering that the fight never really ends." May's hand found hers under the blanket. "Then we keep fighting. Together." Months turned into a year, then two. The foundation grew beyond anything Amara had imagined. They opened offices in cities across the country, partnered with grassroots organizations, and began training a new generation of activists and translators. Amara watched young people step into their power, watched them refuse to be silent, and she felt something she had rarely allowed herself before: joy. But with joy came responsibility. Every victory was fragile, every gain precarious. Laws could be overturned, protections dismantled, progress reversed. The world was still cruel in many ways, still eager to punish difference. Amara learned to live in that tension between hope and fear, triumph and loss, love and struggle. She learned that freedom was not a destination but a journey, one she would walk for the rest of her life. And through it all, May remained her anchor. They built a home together, not just of bricks and walls, but of laughter, of shared mornings, of whispered dreams. A home where love was not hidden, where hands could be held without shame, where family was chosen and cherished. One summer evening, as they sat in the park watching children chase fireflies, May turned to her with a smile. "You know," she said, "we never did talk about the future." Amara laughed softly. "Haven't we been living it?" May shook her head. "I mean, what comes next? For us." Amara tilted her head, curious. "What are you thinking?" May's smile widened. "I'm thinking we've spent years fighting to exist. Maybe it's time we live. Maybe it's time we start a family." Amara's breath caught. For so long, the idea of family had been tangled in pain: her mother's rejection, society's judgment, the fear of not belonging. But as she looked into May's eyes, she saw something different. Possibility. A future where love built more than resistance built life. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Yes, let's build something that no one can erase." The path to that dream was not easy. Adoption agencies asked intrusive questions. Some doors closed the moment they saw two women holding hands. But Amara had learned long ago that walls existed to be broken. And this time, she was not breaking them alone. 2 years later, they welcomed a little girl into their home. Her name was Lila, and from the moment Amara held her, she knew this was the ultimate victory. Not over Richard, not over society, but over fear itself. Lila grew up in a house filled with books and music, with stories of ancestors who had fought and loved fiercely. She grew up watching her mother's lead with courage, knowing she, too, was part of that legacy. Years later, when Amara stood before another crowd, older now, her hair streaked with gray, she held Lila's hand as she spoke. I once believed the world could only be changed by tearing down empires. But I've learned the world is changed just as much by building love, by raising children who know they are enough, by choosing truth every single day. We may never see the end of injustice in our lifetime, but we can plant seeds of freedom that will outlive us. The crowd rose in applause, but Amara barely heard it. All she saw was May smiling at her from the front row, and Lila squeezing her hand with the unshakable certainty of a child who knows she is loved. For the first time in her life, Amara felt the fight had been worth it. Every scar, every tear, every battle worth it. Because here, in this moment, she was not just surviving. She was living, and that was the greatest victory of all. The story of Richard Whitmore faded into history, a cautionary tale of arrogance and downfall. But the story of Amara Johnson, of May, of their love, their family, their foundation, it lived on. Not in headlines, not in courtrooms, but in the lives they touched, in the hope they sparked, in the legacy they built. And though the world remained imperfect, though prejudice lingered and new battles always loomed, Amara knew this truth. Love was stronger than fear, and hope was stronger than hate. She had once been told she was nothing. Now, standing beside her family, she knew she was everything she had ever needed to be. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.